Hello, my name is Emmanuel Josenko. I'm the Director of Graduate Studies and Professor of Finance at the Institute of Higher Education. So welcome to Leading Hospitality Through Turbulent Times. This session, as you know, will be structured as follows. It will be a presentation of about 30 minutes, and there will be 15 minutes for questions at the end of this session. So as you're all aware, we are taking questions in writing only, and you can submit this as we go along using the chat box. And just a reminder that the session is being recorded and will be available on the Moodle platform afterwards. So now I'd like to introduce you to our special guest today. So I'm very happy to have Michel Girardin. Hello, Michel. So Michel is teaching the economy and financial markets at University of Geneva. He has more than 25 years experience as chief economist and chief investment officer in Swiss banking sector. And there is a very interesting topic I will talk about us today. Is basically what is the impact of the COVID-19 on the global economy. And what we want to know, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? And I think this is what Michel will talk about. So thank you very much, Michel, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. It's a real pleasure for me to share with you my thoughts on what this COVID-19 is causing us in terms of the world economy. So yes, the good news is that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and I hope that by the end of my presentation you will be convinced that this light is the end of the tunnel and not the locomotive coming on us. So my presentation, we share it into 3 chapters. We'll first look at at what to look for when we talk about COVID-19. There's lots of charts, lots of statistics we can look for. I chose just a few ones that I believe are key, and then we'll look at recession and recovery. We are right now in the middle of the transition from recession to recovery. That's already a good news. Some countries, as you will see, have already started recovering. So starting with the statistics from COVID-19, what to look for. I'm sure you've seen this kind of charts. It shows the number of COVID-19 cases in 3 countries that we talk a lot, in the US, in Italy. Italy has been the crash test in Europe, has been really badly hit. And then China was hit first by this pandemic. So here you see the evolution, and the US is on the right-hand scale. So here the numbers read, these are in thousands. So you see, for instance, China here, and China has the profile that we want to see, what I call inflection. You know, the minute where the curve no longer is exponential, but goes on more on a log scale. So this is the profile we want to see. We want to see the progression slowing down. This is what we call the inflection point. This point is being reached in the US, has been reached in Italy. US is on the right-hand scale. So here the numbers are bigger indeed than the 2 other countries. Here we're talking about 1.4 million cases of COVID-19 in the US, as opposed to something like 230,000 in Italy and about 80,000 in China. The thing to look at really is not really the number of cases, but more importantly the number of fatalities, which in a way are more closer to what's really going on. And here what we see is the number of fatalities or number of deaths per million people. So the first good piece of news is that the numbers, and here it's not a rebasing to 100 or whatever, these are real numbers. So here we're talking, what we see with all the talks that we have in the US, for instance, you see here that the number and the scales are the same, both left and right. We're talking about 250 casualties per million inhabitants in the US. The number is actually slightly higher than the one we have in Switzerland and here, but you see the number ranges from virtually now 0 in China to just under 600 per million inhabitants in Spain. But more than just the number, which again look relatively, obviously it's very delicate to talk about this issue when we're talking about people dying from this virus, but it's just to put the whole thing in perspective and know what we're talking about. So the first good piece of news here is that the numbers don't look outrageously high in relative terms, and the second good news is that the profile is becoming more showing the slowdown in the progression. And indeed, this is confirmed by what I look at here is the number of fatalities, the changes versus the previous day. And what really important is the trend. The peak was reached around here, around end of March, here for different countries. You see the US, Italy, Spain, CH for Switzerland, France, China. I'll put my laser on so that you see it better. And last, the UK. And see, the trend here is really going down, and this is what matters. We had horrible numbers here around the 23rd. I'll come back to this date. The 23rd of March has been key, and I'll show you why in a minute. And then we had some peaks here. When you see a peaks, it's on Mondays. Mondays, obviously, we're recording the number of casualties for 2 days over the weekend. This is where we get the peaks. So the good news is that the peaks are still, we still see some peaks on Mondays, but these peaks have a lower magnitude and the trend is going down. Okay, now let's go into the recession watch and talk about how deep the recession is going to be, and more importantly also how long. So starting with some hard facts, clearly this pandemic is the most serious global health crisis we've ever had since what we call the Spanish flu or the 1918 Great Influenza. And it's said to become one of the most, not the most, economically costly crises. Macroeconomic costs typically come from both sides, the supply and demand. Supply, because of the casualty, reduces labor supply, and consumer demand, because people obviously consume less. Now, when we had the Spanish flu in 1919, it was mostly the first channel by which we triggered these costs. Here with the COVID-19, as you probably know, it mostly hits the elderly people. So the first factor is not as important, not as relevant as it was for during the Spanish flu. So here, and it's important to understand the difference, it's mostly the impact comes mostly from the fall in consumer demand. And this is why it will be different, and this will be the subject of the second webinar we're going to have in 2 weeks. Where it's important to analyze what measures are being implemented to make sure that consumer demand revives. So the third point that we already mentioned, and here now when we have to estimate, it's obviously a difficult exercise when an economy is shut down, but roughly we can estimate that for each month of large-scale shutdown, can estimate that GDP falls by roughly 20 to 25% on a monthly basis, and this translates into a 5 to 7% annual drop in world GDP. For indeed, this is what we see in this table here, which shows the evolution of growth in all these countries and the world right at the bottom here. And here, that's the number, 5.7 expected now for this year. This is the number which was expected prior to the virus, and here is the difference. And then also importantly to look at the numbers in 2021. Obviously here, and starting with this positive news, get numbers of 10% real GDP growth after inflation. This has never happened. And this is due to some base effects. Clearly, when you're going down After, you just have a small increase, but in relative terms, given the fact that you're comparing yourself to a very depressed number, the number looks very high. So here it's important to also look at the evolution quarter by quarter. Here we have the brunt of the hit will be during the second quarter, and you see here the numbers, they look really appalling. Italy minus 30%, US minus 12%, the Eurozone minus 20%. Okay, so here, okay, we are right now in the midst of the recession. We should see some rebound in Q3 going to Q4, and all in all, this is what you will get. Obviously, that's the number for the world growth, minus 5.7, but obviously there are regional differences. US minus 5.5, but then Eurozone is much higher, 12%. You see here 18% for Italy. So some countries will be more hit than others, that's for sure. And China going minus 5%. The direct impact of the complete shutdown is huge. This is right where we are now. And you see here some statistics, and we were discussing that with Emmanuel just before this talk, and we took this from Moody's Analytics, and they came with this estimate here where we, Emmanuel and myself, discussed that, and they said this looks a bit on the low side. This estimates here of what is hitting our sector, which is of relevance to you. I put this just to show that the whole exercise is difficult. So when you have these falls here of GDP on a monthly basis, again, in the range of 20 to 25% drop, and you say that hotel, restaurants, and air travel only account for, here we could say in the US, this is probably just under maybe 1%. We think that this is too low an estimates, and indeed this will be confirmed in a minute. This is I start here by going into the US, and in the US what really matters is consumption. Consumption accounts for 2/3 of the economy. The US accounts for roughly 23% of the world economy, so we could say that roughly 18% of world growth is in the hands of US consumers. And you see this tight link between the US consumer spending here in Bordeaux and world GDP growth in yellow. So clearly now you see the hit, which is materializing in consumer spending in the US, and this is clearly going to affect world GDP. The number are still high here at 3%, but will come down sharply. Indeed, when we look at the US, we look at the unemployment figures. And here I've identified some recession triggers. This is the number of people who go who claim for a jobless income, jobless claims. And you see this is on a weekly basis. And here the number increase really sharply. What we will see even more here is, sorry, there's a problem here with my screen. Sorry, I will just, here you go. All right, that's the US unemployment rate, and you see it's a staggering rise here, going between 15 and 20%. And this was last seen during the Great Depression, where the unemployment rate hit 25%. So again, in 2 weeks' time, we'll see what makes me more positive and think that we are not going to go through the same depression as in the 30s, although the numbers look comparable now, because the authorities worldwide, and especially in the US, have studied this period here very carefully. and know that they should not, they have to avoid the mistakes which were done during this period. Indeed, we'll see that basically the big mistakes of the 30s was that both the fiscal policy and the monetary policy were kept way too tight after the crash of 1929. And this is what triggered the depression. So clearly today, we're clearly not in the same situation. Therefore, we can be more optimistic about the recovery. Here is a number which tells you a little bit how the impact on an industry which you know well, food services and drinking. Here we had in the US in April 5.5 million jobs lost in restaurants and bars. So clearly this accounts for a lot of the unemployment, certainly much more than an estimate I showed you earlier on. So clearly everything which is linked to leisure, restaurant, food, hotel, transportation is clearly a concern, and I'm sure that's no news to you about what's going on with this COVID-19. Employment drives consumer confidence. This is again also in the US, and you look here, that's in Bordeaux, the evolution of the US unemployment rate, and here is the consumer confidence in yellow. The unemployment rate is shown on the left-hand scale, and the scale is inverted just to show the close link between the two. So here a drop in this Bordeaux line is actually an increase in the unemployment rate. You see it going from roughly 3% to now 15%. So the staggering rise in unemployment rate will trigger a fall and is triggering a fall in consumer confidence. And that's the key to understand what's going on in the US economy, is to look at what the consumer is thinking, how confident the consumers are. These gray vertical bar indicate recession in the US economy. So I've devised this indicator, and it works very well to identify recessions in the US, and it's based on this consumer confidence. And here, when this indicator drops by more than 20%, the recession kicks in, and this is where we are right now. And more importantly, when it goes from minus say 40, 30 something here back to minus 20, so it's important to understand that even when the news flow is still negative, but less so, that can be the end of the recession. And indeed, we'll return to this, but financial markets, they look for this. They look for an improvement. It's just like the inflection point in the COVID-19. The news flow is still negative, but less so. And that's enough for confidence to return and recession to end. Indeed, that's the same message here, and the same type of indicator I've developed here in Europe. And I look at the locomotive of growth in Europe, talking about Germany. My indicator there is also very clear. Indeed, we are in a recession. That's an easy call. And here, what to look for now is to look at when, like here during the Great Recession of 08, it will hit a bottom, maybe here at minus 30, minus 40%, and then it will recover. And by the time we cross this minus 20% threshold, then we can call the end of recession.
Just to clarify, Michel, this indicator is about consumer confidence too, or it's
yes,
yeah.
yes. Again, it's based on consumer confidence. Here, just some numbers showing GDP in some selected countries, but basically everywhere we get the same message. For the time being, it's comparable to what we experienced during what we call the Great Recession of 08. So GDP falls of a magnitude of around minus 5%. Talking about China, here we see that it's already in recovery mode. You see here some traffic from major ports. Here it's based to 100 in January. So it dropped by 40%, and now it's recovered to the situation before the COVID-19. Hotel occupancy rates are not yet back to where they were, but they have recovered. They fell as low as 10%, and now they recover to about 50%. Flight passenger also slowly recovering. So the recovery is in place. Certainly in China, the evidence that we get is more comforting, but it's also showing China was hit before the all other countries, so it's clearly also the first country to come out of the situation, and it's clearly showing the way. So that's encouraging news. So indeed, this is also an indicator I've developed for China. China growth, you see here, the drop, substantial drop from 6% growth here on the left-hand scale to a minus 6. And then here I've developed some indicator based on what we call PMI. PMIs are purchasing manager indices. And I look both for manufacturing sectors, service sectors, new orders, all a combination of this. And I did a combination of all these indices. When it's above 50, we're in expansion mode. Where it's below 50, it's in slowdown mode. So here clearly we hit a low, and here it went even below that scale, but I just put the number here in February 32, and now it's been a quick rebound, and it's again, and that's very comforting, in progression, expansion territory. Okay, economists like to use letters to saying what kind of recovery we're going to have. So we talk about V-shape, W, L, or U. L is not what we want to see. L may a good example of L. We will return to this in 2 weeks when we talk about Japan. Japan has been experiencing, when it's had a huge bubble in the late 80s, and then it burst and the economy went into deflation. So the economy went right to the top and then to the bottom, and then it stayed there for a decade. We talk about the last decades when we talk about Japan. So this is the L scenario. And although some people talk about the Japanization risk in Europe, and we'll see what that refers to in 2 weeks' time, I am not in that camp of believing that we're going to have an L. A V shape would be closer to what we see in China, and a W is probably, you see a V and then you see a re-dip, and that's clearly linked to something we have to mention, the risk of a second or even a third wave. So the scenario I'm banking on is a U-shaped recovery, so a gradual recovery, and it has to be gradual because precisely to avoid the second additional waves of the COVID-19. So to come back here to the COVID-19, here the numbers you see, here this red line here is the stock market. This is the World Equity Index. And you see here, this is since it began falling in February, on the 24th of February. And you see here on this line that it dropped from 100 to close to 65. So it lost 35%. And then it recovered roughly 30% from this low. So now on balance, it's staying at something like 17% below the level it experienced before the COVID-19. Now, the blue line here with these peaks is the COVID-19 number of fatalities worldwide, and it's the variation relative to the previous day. Each time we see a peak, we know it's a Monday. And you see the good news here, we have these horrible peaks here. The horror peak was on March 23rd, when the number of people dying from COVID-19 worldwide increased on this Monday, 23rd of April, relative to the Friday 20th. It grew by 45%, huge number. And since then, You see still the peaks on Mondays. All the scale is here on the right and it's reverted. So an increase in the blue line is actually a fall in the numbers. So here you see the very positive news is now we are at close to zero. And indeed, you see the correlation between the two. So the stock market recovered from the low the day we reached the climax, which we reached the peak in the number of casualties from COVID-19. On that day, we must also say 23rd of March was a key day also for what we're going to discuss in 2 weeks' time. The Federal Reserve, the US Central Bank, announced that it would do limitless injection of liquidity. We call that QE infinity, for quantitative easing, no limits, no amounts. Usually what the central banks do, they say, okay, we're going to do a quantitative easing to the point of $700 billion or what, 2,000 or what have you. Here they say, no limit. Whatever is needed, we're going to inject it. Okay. Now, this thing now about recovering, the market here recovering, and you see a lot of articles, and indeed this is the cover of The Economist this week, saying, is there a gap between what we call Wall Street and Main Street? This is the financial market and this is the economy. Do we see a gap? I don't, but we can leave that for the Q&A. Why I don't think there's a gap between the financial market and the economy. Basically, the financial market is always anticipating what will be true for the economy.
But Michel, but we will continue the conversation in the Q&A. You mentioned also that the central bank is putting billions, trillions on the market, and this might also perturbate a bit the traditional functioning of the market, which is the impact of the QE. But let's leave that for the end of the presentation. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Very good. Okay. So you may have heard this expression here from the Swiss Minister of Health, Alain Berset. When he said that, I said, "Oh my God, this is so Swiss." It has become cult, that sentence. Now you see people wearing T-shirts with that. In French, you say, "Il faut aller aussi vite que possible, mais aussi lentement que nécessaire." So go as fast as possible, but as slowly as necessary. And here you see this picture taken in New York, saying, crossing the second part and say, "Faster, we are American." So clearly, it's a dilemma, and it's clearly challenging time now for the politicians who are governing us. This fight between those who want to go fast and those who want to really put the emphasis on avoiding the next a possible second wave. So the key here is to have both, right? From going from fast or safe dilemma to fast and safe, you know, which is what we're trying to implement in Switzerland, in some other countries where it's also very interesting to look at what they're doing, like Sweden. Sweden did not close the economy as much as other countries. So the infection and what they're looking for is what we call the herd immunization, where a lot of people get the virus and so they become immunized. So the hit on the economy is clearly less. So we can have also a debate on what's going on in Sweden, but it's also very interesting. And in my view, this is clearly going in the camp of fast and safe, which we should be aiming at. For clearly, the problem we have if we delay the recovery is that on the way we might lose some growth. And the permanent loss, what we call the permanent loss candidates, are SMEs, small and medium enterprises, and clearly in the leisure, tourism, travel industry. We have a liquidity crisis right now. But then the key issue here is for this liquidity crisis not to become a default crisis, whereby firms basically go default, and then you have a permanent loss in growth. So clearly, the more you delay the recovery, the higher the risk. And you see this on this chart. If the recovery is delayed, it will recover, but on a lane, on a trend which is far lower than the trend we had prior to the virus. So this is the key risk to manage. Favor as much as you can the quick recovery, and also monitor the risk of a second wave.
So the trend is with respect to the growth, right? So that means we will be on a lower GDP growth path.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And the risk is that the longer we delay, the longer we keep this lockdown, the more gradual the recovery, the more the risk that we lose some lose permanently jobs and growth. We have oil prices here, and I say oil prices to the rescue. Here, these are bars. These bars indicate recessions in the US economy. And you see here, whenever we had really peaks in these oil prices here, rising here in the 70s by more than 200%, here 150, we had recessions. So I put this bar, horizontal bar here, saying that if we do get an increase of more than 50% of the oil prices, that could spell recession. And clearly here, the good news is that now the oil prices is really low. So when you ask economists like me what they think is the most likely scenario, you see here the expectation for a U-shaped recovery is as a consensus call. And the duration of the COVID-19 severe impact on the US economy, it will be mostly Q2, Q3, and then going beyond, you see less people expecting that. So here it's interesting to look at what we should expect in terms of real GDP as compared to other recessions we had. And you see here, this is the drop of growth that we're going to experience. This is 1 quarter after the beginning of the recession. And here you see that it's much sharper fall compared to the previous one, but then the recovery will also be faster. Okay, so conclusions. There is light at the end of the tunnel. The maths, and I hope that by now what I showed you, and this is why it's important when you look at these statistics to put the whole thing in perspective. I know this is a delicate issue. Again, we're talking about people dying from this, but there's lots of people dying every year from influenza. And here, to put it in relative terms, the shutdown, the economy is also making a lot of victims. And so here we need it. It's a tricky balance, but there clearly needs to be found a way to make people go back to work, and also, but also take precautions. Let us manage the risk of the second wave carefully. But clearly the maths of COVID-19 now show that the worst is behind us. And again, to assess that and the statement, I don't look at the number of cases, although clearly here we also see the slowdown. But rather than looking at the cases, I prefer to look at the number of fatalities, because that's a more reliable statistics. The number of cases depends on how willing you are to detect the number of people who have COVID-19. I just take one example. In North Korea, there are officially no cases of COVID-19. Now, clearly, the number of cases are linked to the people traveling back and forth, and obviously in North Korea, the number of people going into North Korea is not very high, but still we can expect that there could be some cases there. But if nobody is willing to detect them, the official numbers will show no cases. Recession we're currently right in the middle of it, and it will be severe, but short. Recovery will be U-shaped as lockdown unwinds progressively. So this is the key, and this is why this U-shaped scenario is the most likely one. We're not going to go back on a spending spree just because we say, okay, now the restaurants are open again. Here in Switzerland, they've opened last Monday, but people ask, well, the weather is not very nice, so people are not really, rushing into the restaurants. It will be gradual, but the economy will recover, and the economy will recover, and this will be addressed, this last point, in 2 weeks' time. We want the world economies to benefit from fiscal and monetary, what we call reflationary policies, i.e. expansionary policies, to help boost demand. And we know, again, comparing this pandemic to a previous pandemic, which was also which was much more lethal than a lot of more casualties than the current one, that in this case, it's really important to boost demands. But then we will also talk about the risks of these expansionary policies in 2 weeks' time. So maybe I'll leave it now for some Q&As, and then I'll show you just 2 slides to.
Okay, thank you very much, Michel. Thanks for this great presentation. So yeah, there are several questions, and I will try to synthesize that, and there's any additional ones that I want to ask you. So the first is, when we talked together, Michel and I, so there is something that we wanted to discuss, is why this risk, there is an expression which is well known in economy, it's times, this time is different, right? So why this recession is different? Because when you think about, it's not the first recession that we experienced, right? So we had already the so-called great recession, the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis of the 2008. We had also 2001 with a terrorist attack, but we also, and I was a bit at the first time surprised, but it's interesting. Also, we already got a lot of pandemia, right? It's not the first pandemia that we experience in humankind. So we can start obviously with the Black Death, the plague that we had in the Middle Age, but we don't have to go so far. That means we already experienced SARS in 2003. We had also Ebola. We had the avian influenza. So the point is, it's not the first time that we experience those rare events. So what makes this time different with respect to what we experienced? You mentioned the Spanish flu, you mentioned 2008. What is different now?
Well, clearly here we're talking about a situation where it's should I say, 2008 is what we call a white swan, and this one is a black swan. The coronavirus is a black swan. A black swan is something which is very unlikely, but if it happens, it has disastrous implications. So it's a very unlikely event with disastrous implication. The recession triggered in 07, 08 is what we call a white swan. Here it's an endogenous reason. Basically, it's debt, what we call debt overhang, excessive debt. The subprime crisis was that people take too much debt. This debt has to be financed, and at one point it's becoming too expensive to finance, and the whole thing collapses. The 2001 recession, which was triggered by the pricking of the internet bubble, was another type of excess, was a valuation excess in financial market. So this one here is a credit excess. debt overhang, and this one is a valuation excess. Both are bubbles, excesses. Here it's a different animal. It's not because markets are too expensive and you get a financial crisis and then an economic crisis. It's not because people take too much debt. Indeed, I have this conviction, and I've studied the history of financial crises, which I find fascinating, going back to the 13th century, when the first bank ever was created. Do you know where that was, Emmanuel?
Was it in Italy, no?
In Italy, yes, that's right. La Monte dei Paschi di Siena, 1291, 1291, I guess it was. And this, so banks and credits, we'll see that in 2 weeks' time, the key role that they played. And it seems that we always have this regularity in financial crisis, in that we always seem to be making the same mistake, taking too much debt. And indeed, a lot of these crises happen because of that. But here, this is a different animal. It's not, debt is not the problem. Actually, debt here becomes the solution. This is very interesting. So we're going to have an increase in debt now, that's for sure. All this money, all this injection from the state to help people financing entrepreneurs, pay the salaries, debt is going to increase. So now clearly there's a whole debate on how we should finance it, but I'll leave that for 2 weeks' time. But clearly here, the difference is that in this case, debt is not the reason why we get the crisis. It is actually the solution to get us out a Great Depression and avoid precisely what happened in the 30s.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for. So second question I wanted also to ask to you is, so we talk about macro data, right? But I just want to know, what are the challenges which are associated with all those statistics? Because those statistics are official statistics which are provided by government. So what are the challenges which are associated to try to have a view of the macroeconomic impact? Because to do so, you need to use, in fact, official statistics. So is there any challenges, and what are the challenges? I'm sure this is linked about the frequency of the data, but not only.
Indeed. Economists like to focus on GDP, gross domestic product, for measuring growth. There are several problems in using that. The first one is, it's quarterly data. Second is, when it's published, there's always going to be a second estimate, and possibly even a third. So the data changes a lot. And so when you get the final estimate, it's really the past, and you're no longer interested in that. So this is what we call low frequency data. The GDP numbers is what we use to define these recessions. But I'm more, rather than looking at GDP, I look at more high frequency data. And this is why I look here at consumer confidence. It's based on monthly numbers. You see here the tight correlation to what's happening on the labor market. The unemployment figures are the first figures they've published on the first Friday of every month. And it's the first figure we get in the US for measuring what's going on in the economy the previous month. And here, this is a very interesting case actually, because you see here even this low frequency, this data of consumer confidence, you see a tumbling here, and economists generally say, okay, if the consumer confidence drops below this level here of 80, that's the beginning of a recession. It works here, it works here, it works here. It does not work here. And this is when I realized that actually here, this is the peak of the optimism of US consumers. the peak of the bubble, just before it burst, people were so excited about this new economy, a new world, you know. And so here US consumers are totally euphoric. And then suddenly they drop and they go from being extremely euphoric to be just very optimistic. And that's enough to trigger a recession. So what I decided to say, I need to adjust this consumer confidence, and this is what I do here. And I look at changes in this consumer confidence, and that works much better. And here it's enough to have a drop of this consumer confidence by more than 20%, just to call it a recession. And then here you see, and then you're able to identify very precisely and timely the end of recession by looking at high frequency data like consumer confidence.
Yeah, correct. And some people are also talking about nowcasting. Can you explain what is the meaning of nowcasting in with respect to trying to use some macro data?
All right. Nowcasts is a interesting statistic published by the, you know, that in the US, the Federal Reserve, which is a central bank, has some regional agencies. And so the Federal Reserve of Atlanta is publishing that nowcast. And basically, it's to compensate, it's to try to alleviate this problem of publishing a statistics that when you get the final estimates, it's too outdated and you're not really interested in that, because we may know maybe in, I don't know, in September what has really happened in the first quarter in the US, but who is interested about that? We're always, and certainly not financial markets. Financial markets are looking ahead. This is why I don't believe there's a gap between what financial markets are saying and they're rebounding and the economy, because financial markets, they want to know if there's going to be light at the end of the tunnel, if there's going to be an end to the recession. And when they're convinced about that, when they see that the number of fatalities is decreasing, that's enough for them to bottom out. So yes, Atlanta nowcast is what they're doing is they're looking at all the components that enter into GDP, and they try to get some, as the numbers become public, they try to give you an accurate estimate of what the GDP number is going to be.
Okay, and going back to thanks, going back to your point about the Main Street and Wall Street. So this is something which is going on. Actually, a lot of people are talking about that. That means I was just looking the numbers, but you have that in your graph. If you look, for instance, from the start of the quarter, right? So just the last 2 months, we can see that stock market, because what we're talking about is stock market when we talk about Wall Street. We see that the performance is 8% in US term. That means since start of April, it's 8% MSCI World, 8% MSCI USA. Right. So it's a bit, yeah. What is your view on that? So how can we explain that we have something which is posting 8% for stock markets, where when we're reading the press, the news, you know, well, there certainly is light at the end of the tunnel, but actually, you know, it starts to be gloomy, right, in terms of GDP figure.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Do you think that, as you say, stock are anticipatory and they keep this capability, or is there any disconnection between stock markets and the overall economy?
That's right. Yes. Yeah, it's very interesting question. It's a debate we can have also. Clearly, the stock market is looking forward, is looking ahead, not backwards. This is why also you can use the stock market as a leading indicator of economic activity. There are various indices you can look. Some people look at the slope of the yield curve as a leading indicator. I used to do that, but no longer, because I think, and again, we can talk about this in 2 weeks' time when we talk about monetary policy. The current conduct of monetary policy makes this indicator not reliable. But here clearly the stock market is anticipating that the thing is going to get better. It knows, if you look at this chart, you have the story here, right when it bottoms out. Here it bottoms out the day the number of people dying from COVID-19 increases by 45% worldwide. And then we also have here actually in the US, the Monday after the 30th, we got an even higher peak. Here the world is decreasing, but in the US it peaked on March the 30th. So clearly the stock market knows the news flow is still negative, but it is anticipating that it will improve. Again, it's the inflection point that is mattering. Again, even like when the consumer confidence goes from minus 60% fall to minus 20, so it's increasing, it's still negative. But that's enough for the stock market to call the end of recession and therefore light at the end of the tunnel. There's going to be a world post-COVID-19. People will return to gradually to normality. And so that's what matters to the stock market. I've been through lots of crises. You know, I started working as a chief economist, as you said, Emmanuel, in the banking sector in 1987. A few months after I started working, I got the crash, the stock market crash in 1987. We had one in 1994 that was more for the bond market. In 1998, we had the Asian crisis. In 2000, a big bubble bursting, a big correction here, 50% fall in the stock market. And that's for just the whole market. For the internet stocks, the losses were way more than 50%. And clearly then the Great Recession of 2007. What really is important to remember is that when you get the falls here, and I recall, like during previous falls, you look at people who are in this business of managing money, investment management, and they look so depressed. You know, they just think, my God, you know, this is completely crazy. A market losing 7%, like the CAC 40, you know, or even the SPI in Switzerland losing 7% in a day. You go back home, you return to work, and the next day it loses again 7%. And you think it's not going to end. Why? Because here you don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. You just see it getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And the stock market, they hate that. What they hate is the lack of visibility. You don't know what's going on. Maybe you say it's the end of the world, and indeed you hear some people say it's going to be the end of the world, you know, Great Depression again. So, well, the market is in a free fall. Some people, I remember here during those days, were calling even to shut down the equity market, the stock markets worldwide. Let's say, let's shut them down and wait for a return to normality, to open them up again. So clearly, again, what matters for the stock market and for financial markets in general is to know that, to have visibility again, and to know that, okay, we still are in the middle of a recession, but we can already see the end of it.
But as you said, there is a debate, and if you're looking the US, some will have a different view and will tell you, for instance, that when you're looking to the sector composition, now, for instance, in the S&P 500, it's mainly driven by Apple, Facebook. That means all the high-tech companies, which basically are the winners of this situation. So what is your view on that?
Yes, correct, Emmanuel. There's a problem we have. That's the world we're living in. Now, if you look at the 10 largest companies worldwide, you'll find that 8 of these names are technology companies. So this is the world we're living in. This is maybe a separate issue of whether this crisis is going to exacerbate inequality, distribution of income. Certainly, that was also the problem before the COVID-19. Certainly, the situation is not going to improve here. And also maybe the fact that the Amazons of this world will clearly become even more powerful than they were beforehand. So yes, agreed. When we talk about the stock market, then we have to dig in more accurately and look at what's behind this global thing we call the stock market. Maybe there's a concentration and a sector composition which is tilted a bit too much towards these technology monsters. Correct.
Okay, so I have a last question because we are close to the end. So looking, in fact, there are two questions that I can, in fact, merge. So there were one attendee that was asking, in fact, what kind of recovery you expect from a country like France, where the main source of income is tourism. And there were a second question related because it's all about the recovery. Talking about Germany and saying that in the past few years, past few days, sorry, the number of cases, COVID-19 cases were increasing again, and can we face a new peak? So I think the question here is about what is your view about the recovery and the fact that, and we were discussing that also in terms of testing, we could be in a situation where we relax the distancing measure, and we can have, in fact, again, an increase of the cases that will impact the economy. So it's I think the debate between flattening the fatality curve and flattening the recession, right? It's how we deal with that.
Right, right. Well, clearly France will be hit and is being hit. Here you see here this drop of 19% in Q2 of GDP, which will bring the fall here to a -10 for the whole year. Paris is the place in the world, or the city, or even the place which is receiving the most tourists in the world. So it's the capital of tourism, should we say, worldwide. So it will be hit, clearly. Some other countries not listed here, like Greece, for instance, will be even more hit. The economy of Greece is not as important and not as large as France, but Greece had its own problems and came out of its own problems and was going to experience at long last some growth of 2.5–3% this year. That was pre-COVID-19, and now they're going to drop by at least 10, possibly even more. And clearly there, the dependence there on tourism from abroad is even higher than in France. In France, when you read the news, you see that there's lots of calls, like in Switzerland as well, to call for some nationalistic, how should I say, behavior of saying, now let's spend the holidays at home in France. And you see that lots of reservations in the south of France. I'm actually planning to go there, but I don't know if I can get out of Switzerland. I'm a bit divided because I love the south of France, so I want to go there, but I am also going to support the Swiss economy and spend my holiday here. So clearly there's going to be, I'm sure it's not going to be as if we had not had this COVID-19, but some support for the French economy will come from the fact that a lot of the French people will stay in France and will have their holidays in France. For Germany, and it's not as a major influence as in Sweden. I look at the case of Sweden very closely because Sweden is very interesting from this herd immunity, that policy that they're following, of saying basically they did not do any lockdown, but they just gave advice to people as to properly behave and keep social distancing. So here I don't have the numbers, but clearly the Sweden economy will be less hit than all the others because they did not close the restaurants. They remain in pretty much business as usual mode. The mortality rate is increasing a bit more than in the other Nordic countries like Norway or Denmark, but it's certainly not as so catastrophic as some people were arguing in February, saying that those people, like in the UK, they were also wanted to follow the same policy. And then some doctors and experts told Boris Johnson that he would, if he were to follow that strategy, he had to count on millions of dead people in the UK. So he reversed policy. So it's a whole debate. And in Germany, clearly now what we're seeing again is you open up, and we're going to have that in Switzerland as well. You know, you open up the economy, you're going to see the number of cases increasing again, but then the whole thing depends on behavior, social distancing, detection. This is also something we did not address, but you know, when we talk about COVID-19, we talk about the famous R0, R0, which is the coefficient of reproduction, shall we say, of le taux d'infection, the infection rate. So before the COVID-19 started, it was at more than 2. So it means one person that is infected will infect 2 other persons. And then so you see here the escalation. Clearly those 2 persons and the next day will infect each 2. So it becomes 4, etc., etc. So the whole thing about, rather than locking, unlocking, and then you get a second wave and you relock again, we cannot afford having a re-lockdown of the economy. So what we need to ensure is that we identify the people who have the virus. That's before we get the vaccine, actually, yes. And before we have one, we have to identify, we have to detect the people who have the COVID-19 and put them in quarantine. And that's the normal way of reducing the R0. If the R0, the R0 is below 1, then the virus, the pandemic will die out. If it's above 1, it will expand.
Okay, so thanks very much. Thank you so much, Michel, for all this insight, for the time you spend. I want to thank you on the behalf of Lyon. I want also to thanks to all the attendees. You will have other session. You will have another session with Michel and myself where we will talk, as you said, something very important. Here was just putting the stage, and this is a light at the end of the tunnel. The question is, what is the path to reach this light? And we will talk about what the monetary policy is, what budgetary policies are, and there are a lot of interesting stuff, because there will be consequences with respect to the trillions of dollars that will be needed, in fact, so that we will be able to hand to this tunnel. And so this is something that we will discuss with Michel, having his expertise on what is going on and what might be our new world based on the trillions of dollars that we'll need to use to exit this situation. So thank you all. I think you wanted to share something, Michel, before the end?
Yes, that's just my my minute of extra from the conclusions, and just to highlight, go in the same direction as this light at the end of the tunnel. I want to, I'm sure in the audience there are people who speak Mandarin. So the question I'm asking you is, do you know how to say crisis in Mandarin? And the answer is, the word crisis does not exist in China, does not exist in Mandarin. It's actually 2 words. Here they are. This is Wei and this is Ji. Wei means danger, and Ji, excuse my pronunciation, I'm doing my best, means opportunity. I know it's a bit of a debate here where people, experts, linguists say, yeah, it's not maybe correctly translated, but I know for sure it was used by one of the former presidents in the US, John Kennedy. It said he made that statement, which I'm going to discuss now, famous. He said, whenever there is a danger, there's an opportunity. And he said in China, the word crisis does not exist. It's these two words, and it says, if you have danger, you also have opportunity. So what I'm going to show you is that we also have that in French. So the thing only works in French, but I'll translate it to you. So in French, we get this word, which is reprise, which means recovery. I did that myself. I'm quite proud of it. I did a bit of numerology here. So numerology, you take these three letters, R, E, P, and you look at their position in the French alphabet, 18th letter, 5th, 16th. So you do the total of these, and that's 39. Now, numerology, you need to boil down to just one number. So you add 3 and 9, that's 12. You add 1 and 2, and that's 3. Now, what's the third letter of the alphabet, Emmanuel? You know?
ABC. I'm following.
Right.
I'm still there.
Well done. So you see here that this word reprise has the same numerological value as if you replace those three letters by this one here, C, and that becomes crise. So this is my conclusion. Dans chaque crise, il est une reprise. Il y a une reprise. In each crisis, there is a recovery.
Yeah, great conclusion. Thank you, Michel. Thank you all.
Thank you all. And I look forward to see you. It's a shame that I use Zoom when I teach at university, and with Teams, I don't know, but I just spoke to my PowerPoint. Normally I should see at least some. I see you, Emmanuel. I see you rectangulars, but I hope you enjoyed this presentation.
Yeah, very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michel.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.